breaking the great hall of the Galactic Concord stood silent for the first time in 3,000 years as ambassador. Telvex of the Vethkai Dominion rose from her seat and spoke words that no one had spoken since the ancient wars. The Pax Galactica is void, she declared, her mandibles clicking with each syllable. The Vethkai Dominion no longer recognizes its authority. For a moment, nobody moved and nobody breathed. And nobody could quite believe what they had just heard. The Concord Chamber was a marvel of engineering that floated in neutral space, far from any single species' territory. And it had been built as a symbol of unity after the terrible Ember Wars that had killed billions across 100 worlds. 3 millennia ago, 17 species had signed the peace treaty in this very room. And 17 species had kept that peace through trade and diplomacy and the shared memory of what war had cost them all. Now one of them had just torn that treaty apart with a single sentence. The chamber erupted into chaos as representatives scrambled for their communication devices and shouted questions and demands in a dozen different languages that the translation system struggled to process all at once. Crystalline Sovereignty's ambassador, a being of living gemstone whose body refracted light into rainbows, stood and pointed an accusatory limb at the Vethkai delegation. This is madness, the Sovereignty's representative declared. You would plunge us all back into darkness for what purpose? Telvex turned her compound eyes toward the crystal being, and there was no remorse in her gaze, only cold calculation. Your people have expanded into the nebula territories, she said. Resources that should belong to the Dominion now feed your growing empire while our hive worlds starve. Those territories were uncontested, the Sovereignty protested. They are contested now. More shouting followed as ancient alliances were invoked, and old grudges resurfaced like wounds that had never truly healed. And species that had not thought about war in generations suddenly remembered that they still had enemies in the far corner of the chamber. In a modest alcove that befitted their relatively recent admission to the Concord, the human delegation watched the chaos unfold with curious expressions. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat in her chair with a cup of tea in her hands, and she sipped it calmly as if she were watching a mildly interesting play rather than the collapse of galactic civilization. Her military attaché, a young officer named Commander Torres, leaned close to whisper in her ear, "Ma'am, the Vethkai have just effectively declared war on 6 species at once, and we have defense treaties with 3 of them." Vasquez nodded slowly and took another sip of her tea. "So we do," she said. "Should we not be concerned?" The ambassador turned to look at her young officer, and there was something in her eyes that Torres could not quite read. Something old and patient and perhaps a little sad. "Commander, humanity spent most of its history fighting itself," Vasquez said quietly. "We invented new ways to kill each other every generation, and we got very good at it before we finally learned that there had to be a better way." She set down her cup and folded her hands in her lap. When you have truly known war, when you have seen what it costs and what it takes from everyone involved, you do not panic when someone threatens to bring it back. Torres frowned at this answer. "Then what do? We wait," Vasquez replied. "We watch and we prepare, and we hope that wisdom prevails before we are required to remind the galaxy why humanity chose peace in the first place." Across the chamber, the Vethkai delegation was making its exit, their insectoid bodies moving in perfect synchronization as they marched toward the doors as they passed the human alcove. Ambassador Thelvex paused and turned her multifaceted eyes toward Vasquez. "You are quiet, human," the Vethkai said. "Do your people have nothing to say about the death of your precious peace?" Vasquez rose from her chair slowly and faced the alien ambassador with a pleasant expression. "We have a great deal to say, Ambassador Thelvex, but we find that saying it loudly rarely helps. "You are weak," Thelvex clicked dismissively. "Your species has been coddled by this Concord, protected by the strength of others, while you play at being merchants and philosophers." "Perhaps," Vasquez agreed mildly, "when the Dominion has finished with our immediate enemies, we may turn our attention to you as well. And what will your philosophy do against our swarm fleets?" The human ambassador smiled, and it was a strange smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I suppose we will have to wait and see." Thelvex made a sound that might have been laughter and continued her march out of the chamber, leaving chaos in her wake. When the Vethkai were gone, Torres turned to Vasquez with barely contained frustration. "She just threatened us directly. And you smiled at her?" "Yes." Why, Vasquez picked up her tea again and found that it had gone cold. And she frowned slightly at this minor inconvenience. "Because, Commander, there is an old saying on Earth that my grandmother taught me when I was very young." She paused and looked out the great windows of the Concord chamber at the stars that stretched endlessly in every direction. Stars that would soon be darkened by war. "Beware the anger of a patient man," she said softly. "Or in this case, a patient species." She turned back to her staff with a more businesslike expression. "Contact New Geneva and inform the Central Council that the pox has been broken. And tell Admiral Chun to begin reviewing the contingency files." "What contingency files?" "The ones we hoped we would never need," Vasquez said. "The ones that have been gathering dust in our archives since humanity first joined the Concord 800 years ago." Torres felt a chill run down his spine as he realized that the calm he had, mistaken for weakness, was something else entirely. It was the calm of someone who had already accepted what was coming and had, long ago, decided what they would do about it around them. The galaxy began its descent into war, and humanity watched with patient eyes and waited for the moment when waiting would no longer be enough. In the archives beneath New Geneva, in rooms that had not been opened in centuries, lights flickered on for the first time in generations as teams of historians and strategists began pulling ancient files from storage files about something humanity had once been very good at, something they had chosen to set aside but had never truly forgotten: war. The gathering storm. 3 months had passed since the breaking, and the galaxy was burning. The Vethkai swarm fleets moved through space like locusts, consuming everything in their path and leaving only ashes and silence. Behind them, the crystalline sovereignty had been the first to fall, their beautiful gem ships shattered against the endless waves of Vethkai drones that cared nothing for beauty or art or the ancient songs that the crystal beings had sung since the dawn of their civilization too. More species had surrendered within weeks, their leaders kneeling before the Vethkai queens and accepting whatever terms were offered because the alternative was extinction. 3 others fought on desperately, but everyone could see that they were losing, their fleets growing smaller with each battle, while the swarm only grew larger. And through it all, humanity watched on the administrative world of New Geneva. The Central Council of the Human Commonwealth met in emergency session as reports flooded in from every corner of known space counselor. Amara Okonkwo stood at the head of the great table and looked at the holographic display that showed the spreading crimson of Vethkai conquest. "The refugee situation is becoming critical," she said. "We have already accepted 3 million displaced persons from the fallen territories, and more arrive every day. Our resources are not unlimited," another counselor pointed out. "If we continue at this rate, our own people will begin to suffer." "Then our own people will suffer," Okonkwo replied firmly. "The Commonwealth does not turn away those who flee from war." This was not a popular position among some members of the council, but it was the position that won the vote. And so humanity opened its borders while others closed their colony. Ships that had been designed to carry settlers to new worlds were converted into refugee transports. and space stations expanded their capacity to accommodate the endless stream of frightened beings who had nowhere else to go. The Vethkai noticed this, of course, and they sent a message to the Commonwealth demanding that humanity stop interfering with their conquest by sheltering their enemies. The Commonwealth's response was polite, but firm. "We do not shelter your enemies." The diplomatic reply stated, "We shelter the innocent, and we will continue to do so regardless of your demands." This angered the Vethkai, but they had other concerns for the moment, and so they marked humanity down as a problem to be dealt with later in the military headquarters beneath New Geneva's capital city. Admiral Chen Wei-lin stood before a room full of officers and pointed to the strategic display. "Current projections suggest the Vethkai will reach our borders in approximately 8 months, she said. "Possibly 6 if they decide to prioritize our trade routes." "Can we defend ourselves?" asked General Morrison, the commander of ground forces. "We can defend our core systems indefinitely," Chen replied. "Our defensive infrastructure has been quietly upgraded over the past 3 months using technologies we have not previously deployed." "Why were these technologies not deployed before?" The admiral smiled slightly. "Because we did not need them before, and because some things are better kept in reserve until they are truly necessary." She changed the display to show a different map, one that showed not just human space, but the entire galaxy. "The Vethkai believe they understand us," Chun continued. "They see merchants and diplomats and philosophers, and they assume that is all we are. Is it not?" "No," the admiral said simply. "It is what we chose to become, but it is not all that we are capable of being." She pulled up another file, one marked with security classifications that most of the officers in the room had never seen before. "Humanity spent thousands of years at war with itself," Chun explained. "We fought over land and resources and religion and ideology, and sometimes for no reason at all, except that we had forgotten how to do anything else." The display showed images from Earth's history, images of battles and weapons, and the terrible creativity that humans had applied to the art of killing each other. "We learned things during those years," the admiral said. "Things about strategy and tactics and the psychology of conflict that no other species in the galaxy has had the opportunity to learn, because no other species has spent quite so long fighting itself." "And you believe these lessons are still relevant?" Morrison asked. "I believe that war does not change as much as people think it does," Chun replied. "The weapons evolve and the scale increases, but the fundamental principles remain the same." She closed the file and looked at her officers with an expression that was calm but deadly serious. "For 800 years, we have been students of this galaxy," she said. "We have learned from every species we encountered, studied their technologies and their cultures and their ways of thinking. And now we are going to show them what we learned from ourselves, across human space." Preparations continued in silent shipyards that had produced merchant vessels for centuries, began producing something else, something faster and more dangerous, that bore no resemblance to the peaceful trading ships that humanity was known for. Scientists who had spent their careers studying medicine and agriculture quietly shifted their focus to other applications of their knowledge, and in the training facilities scattered across 100 worlds, soldiers who had never expected to fight anything more serious than pirates began learning old lessons that humanity had hoped would never be needed again. The galaxy did not notice these preparations, because humanity did not want them to notice. The Vethkai certainly did not notice, because they were too busy celebrating their victories and planning their next conquests. But some among the refugee populations began to sense that something was different about their human hosts. A crystalline sovereignty survivor, one of the few who had escaped the destruction of her homeworld, spoke to a human aid worker one evening as they watched the stars from a refugee camp on a human colony world. Your people are very calm. The crystal being observed. Others panic and despair, but humans simply continue with their work as if nothing unusual is happening. The aid worker, a young woman named Sarah, considered this observation for a moment before responding. We have seen hard times before, she said. We know that panic does not help. It is more than that, the sovereignty survivor insisted. There is something in your eyes that I do not understand. Something that looks like patience, but feels like something else. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, looking up at the stars that the Vethkai were slowly conquering. My grandmother used to tell me stories about the old wars on Earth. She finally said, about the terrible things that humans did to each other before we learned better. And what did she say about those times? She said that humanity's greatest strength was not our ability to fight. Sarah replied, it was our ability to stop fighting and choose something better. She turned to look at the crystal being with an expression that was gentle, but also somehow fierce. But she also said that if someone forced us to remember what we had chosen to leave behind, they would learn why we had been so eager to forget it. The sovereignty survivor felt a chill pass through her crystalline body. Though she could not have explained exactly why 8 months seemed like a very long time, but it also seemed like it might not be long enough. The message 6 months after the breaking? The Vethkai vanguard arrived at the border of human. Space High Commander Velthrix stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the stars that lay beyond the invisible line that marked the edge of human territory. 40,000 ships floated behind her, the largest swarm fleet ever assembled, ready to sweep across these soft mammals and add their worlds to the Dominion's growing empire. Open a channel to the human border stations, Velthrix commanded. Let them see what comes for them. Her communications officer obeyed, and soon the image of a human border patrol captain appeared on the screen. The human looked remarkably calm for someone facing annihilation. High Commander, the human said, the human Commonwealth has been expecting you, and we have a representative waiting to speak with you. Velthrix clicked her mandibles in amusement. You wish to negotiate your surrender already, and I had hoped for at least some resistance to make this interesting. Not exactly, the human replied. Director OB will explain. The screen flickered, and a new face appeared. He was a middle-aged human male with dark skin and gray hair, wearing simple civilian clothes that seemed almost insulting given the military might arrayed against him. High Commander Velthrix, the man said pleasantly. I am Director Samuel Obi of the Commonwealth Office of External Relations, and I have been authorized to deliver a message from the human Commonwealth. Speak your surrender terms. Mammal, Velthrix said. Be quick about it, and we may show mercy to your breeding populations. Director Obi nodded as if this were a perfectly reasonable statement. The message is this, he began. We understand that your species faces resource scarcity, and we understand that fear and desperation have driven your expansion across the galaxy. Velthrix tilted her head, confused by this opening. We do not hate you for this, Obi continued. Survival is a powerful motivation, and we cannot fault any species for wanting to ensure its future. You speak of understanding, Velthrix said impatiently. But understanding does not stop our fleets. No, Obi agreed. It does not, he paused, and something in his expression changed. Something subtle that Velthrix could not quite identify, however. You have broken a peace that cost billions of lives to establish, and you have displaced populations and destroyed worlds and shown no indication that you will stop until you have consumed everything in your path. We take what we need, Velthrix said proudly. This is the way of the strong. Perhaps, Obi said, but it is not our way. And so I have been instructed to inform you of the following. He folded his hands in front of him, and his voice remained calm and even as he spoke. If you proceed beyond this point, humanity will not merely defend itself. Velthrix leaned forward. Curious despite herself, we will end your capacity to wage war. Obi continued. Permanently, and not through genocide. Because we find that distasteful. But through the systematic dismantling of every military asset, every war-making facility, and every command structure your dominion possesses. The bridge of the flagship fell silent. This process will take approximately 14 months, Obi said. It will be thorough, and when it is complete, you will begin the long work of rebuilding as a peaceful species. He paused. Or you will not rebuild at all. Velthrix stared at the human on her screen, unable to process what she was hearing. You threaten us, she finally said. You, with your merchant ships and your refugee camps. You dare to threaten the greatest military power in the galaxy. I am not threatening you. High Commander. And what do you call this? Obi's expression remained perfectly calm. I call it a scheduled event, he said. The only variable is whether it begins tomorrow or never. And the choice is entirely yours. He glanced at something off-screen. You have one standard day to withdraw beyond Concord borders, he continued. We will not repeat this offer, and we will not negotiate its terms. And if we refuse, then 14 months from now, give or take a few weeks, your species will no longer possess the ability to wage war against anyone. And you will have a very long time to reflect on whether this outcome was worth the worlds you have already conquered. The director smiled. And it was not a warm smile. We genuinely hope you will make the wise choice, High Commander. But we are fully prepared for the alternative. The transmission ended. Velthrix stood motionless for a long moment, her compound eyes fixed on the blank screen where the human's face had been. Then she began to laugh. It started as a soft chittering sound and grew into a full cackling roar that echoed through the bridge and caused her officers to shift uncomfortably at their stations. Did you hear that? She demanded of her crew. These soft creatures, these philosophers and merchants, they think they can threaten us. Her officers clicked their mandibles in nervous agreement. They have lost their minds, Velthrix declared. The fear of our approach has driven them to madness. And they actually believe they can defeat 40,000 ships with warnings and words. She turned to her tactical officer. Plot a course into human space, she commanded. We will show these mammals what happens to those who threaten the Dominion. High Commander, her second officer said hesitantly. Perhaps we should report this to the Queens first. The Queen sent us to conquer, Velthrix snapped. Not to run from the empty threats of prey animals. She looked out at the stars that awaited her. In one day, we will cross their border, and in 1 week, we will be burning their colonies, and in 1 month, we will be standing on their homeworld. Her mandibles clicked in anticipation. And then we will see how calm they are. The fleet began its final preparations for the crossing. And not one among the 40,000 ships considered the possibility that the humans might have been telling the truth after all. What could these soft, peaceful creatures possibly do against the mightiest military force the galaxy had ever seen in 24 hours? They would find out, and in 24 hours, the galaxy would learn why humanity had chosen to become merchants and philosophers and diplomats. It was not because they were incapable of being anything else. It was because they had seen what they were capable of. And they had decided that the galaxy deserved better. But if the galaxy insisted on war, then humanity would give them a war unlike anything they had ever imagined. Not a war of conquest or hatred or revenge, a war of absolute, surgical, terrifying precision, a war designed not to destroy the enemy, but to make the enemy unable to be an enemy ever again. The Vethkai had broken a 3,000-year peace humanity was about to show them exactly what that peace had cost. The reckoning. The Vethkai fleet crossed the border at exactly 600 hours. Universal Standard Time High Commander Velthrix watched from her bridge as her 40,000 ships moved forward in perfect formation, ready to sweep aside whatever pathetic resistance the humans could offer at 602 minutes. The first anomalies appeared on their sensors at 608 minutes. Their communications network collapsed into chaos at 614 minutes. The largest military force in galactic history ceased to exist as a coherent fighting force. It happened so fast that most of the Vethkai crews never understood what was happening to them. Ships that had been flying in formation suddenly found themselves alone, cut off from their commanders and their fellow vessels by something that twisted their communications into useless static weapon systems that had been fully charged and ready to fire. Went dark as targeted electromagnetic pulses struck with surgical precision, disabling the specific components needed for combat without damaging life support or navigation engines that had been propelling the fleet forward. Sputtered and died as microscopic devices attached themselves to critical systems and shut them down from the inside. The humans had not come to fight a battle, they had come to perform surgery on a fleet. Velthrix screamed orders at her crew, but her orders went nowhere because her communications were dead, and even if they had worked, there was no one left to receive them. Her tactical display showed her fleet scattered across space like leaves in a storm, each ship isolated and helpless and slowly being surrounded by human vessels that seemed to appear from nowhere. These were not the merchant ships that humanity was known for. These were something else entirely. Something sleek and fast and utterly terrifying in their efficiency. They moved through the Vethkai formation like predators among prey. But they did not kill. They disabled. They captured. They conquered without destroying. Velthrix watched as a human ship attached itself to one of her escort vessels and deployed boarding parties that cut through the hull with tools that seemed to slice through metal like it was nothing. She expected to see her soldiers fight and die defending their ship. Instead, she saw them surrender within minutes, overwhelmed by human marines in armor that shrugged off plasma fire as if it were rain. The marines did not execute the prisoners. They secured them and provided medical care and moved on to the next target. It was the most terrifying thing Velthrix had ever witnessed. War was supposed to be chaos and destruction and death. But this was something else, something cold and controlled and utterly implacable. The humans were not fighting a war. They were conducting an operation, and they were very, very good at it. Hours passed, and one by one, the ships of the great Vethkai fleet fell silent, not destroyed but disabled. Not killed but captured by the end of the first day. 70% of the fleet was in human hands by the end of the second day. It was 90%. Velthrix's flagship was the last to fall. She had watched her entire command crumble around her, watched the unstoppable tide of human efficiency sweep through her forces like nothing she had ever seen. When the boarding alarms finally sounded on her own ship, she gathered her bridge crew and prepared to make a final stand. If she was going to die, she would die fighting. The doors to the bridge exploded inward, and human marines poured through the opening with weapons raised and movements perfectly coordinate. Velthrix raised her own weapon and prepared to fire. A single shot struck her gun and knocked it from her grip, and she realized with shock that the human had not aimed at her body. He had aimed at her weapon. "High Commander Velthrix," the lead marine said, his voice surprisingly calm given the circumstances. "I am Lieutenant Commander James Chun of the Human Commonwealth Marine Corps." He holstered his weapon and reached into his belt for something. Velthrix tensed, expecting a killing blow. Instead, he produced a small device and held it out to her. "This is a translation device," he explained. "It will allow us to communicate more effectively." Velthrix stared at the device and then at the human who had offered it. "You "Do not kill me," she said. "No. Why? The Marine considered the question for a moment. "Because you and your crew are now prisoners of war under the New Geneva Convention," he said. "You will be treated humanely, given medical care, provided with adequate food and shelter, and eventually repatriated to your homeworld when hostilities conclude." Velthrix felt her legs weaken beneath her. "This makes no sense," she said. "We came to conquer you, to enslave your people and burn your worlds." "Yes," the Marine agreed. "You did, and yet you show us mercy." Lieutenant Commander Chen shook his head. "Not mercy," he said. "Efficiency." He gestured for his team to secure the bridge, and they moved with the same terrifying precision that had characterized the entire operation. "Dead soldiers cannot be rehabilitated," Chun explained. "Destroyed ships cannot be repurposed, and broken enemies carry grudges that lead to future wars." He looked at Velthrix with eyes that held no hatred, only a kind of weary professionalism. "The goal was never to destroy you, High Commander, and it was to stop you. Those are different things." "Yes," he said, "they are." And humanity spent a very long time learning the difference. Across Vethkai space, the same scene repeated itself thousands of times over the following months. Human task forces appeared without warning and dismantled military installations with surgical precision, capturing rather than destroying, disabling rather than killing shipyards that had produced the Dominion's war machine, were occupied and repurposed weapons. Factories were carefully deconstructed by engineering teams that seemed to know exactly how each facility worked. Command centers were taken intact, their records and communications preserved for future analysis, and everywhere the human forces went, they brought something else besides soldiers. They brought food, they brought medicine, they brought construction materials and engineers and doctors and teachers. Even as they dismantled the machinery of war, they began building the foundations of peace. The Vethkai populations watched in confusion as their conquerors fed them and healed them and protected them from the chaos that their own leaders had unleashed. This was not how war was supposed to work. This was not how enemies were supposed to behave, but the humans did not seem to care about how things were supposed to work. They cared only about results. 14 months after the crossing, exactly as Director Obi had promised, the Vethkai Dominion no longer possessed the ability to wage war against anyone. Their fleets were gone, captured or dismantled. Their weapons were gone, destroyed or secured. Their military leadership was gone, imprisoned or removed from power. But their people remained, their worlds remained, their future remained, and humanity stood over them not as conquerors, but as something far more confusing. They stood as guardians waiting for the Vethkai to learn what humanity had learned so long ago, that there were better ways to be strong than through violence, that there were better ways to survive than through conquest, that the hardest and most important thing any species could do was choose to be better than their instincts told them to be. Reckoning was complete, but the lesson was only beginning. The calm after 14 months after the breaking. The Galactic Concord Chamber reopened its doors for the first time since the day the peace had died. The chamber had been damaged during the chaos that followed the Vethkai Declaration, and humanity had quietly funded its reconstruction as part of their broader campaign to rebuild what war had destroyed. Now representatives from every surviving species gathered once again in the Great Hall, and they looked upon each other with eyes that had seen too much and lost too much and learned things about themselves that they wished they had never needed to learn. Ambassador Elena Vasquez entered the chamber wearing the same simple diplomatic attire she had worn on the day the pox had broken. She took her seat in the human delegation's alcove, the same seat she had occupied when Ambassador Thelvex had declared the peace void. and she waited for the assembly to convene. Galaxy had expected many things from humanity. After their victory, they had expected demands for territory, and to tribute and submission they had expected humanity to claim the empire that their military power had proven they could take. They had expected humans to become the new masters of known space, replacing the Vethkai threat with a human one. They had not expected what actually happened. Ambassador Vasquez rose to address the assembly, and the chamber fell silent. The human Commonwealth has asked me to present the following proposals for the consideration of this assembly. She began. First, we propose the reconstruction of the Pax Galactica under revised terms that address the underlying issues which led to its collapse, including resource inequality, territorial disputes, and the economic grievances that drove the Vethkai to such desperate action. Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Second, we propose the establishment of a joint peacekeeping force, trained and equipped to prevent future conflicts before they begin. A force that will answer to the Concord as a whole rather than to any single species. More murmurs. Louder this time. Third, and most importantly, we propose the full reintegration of the Vethkai Dominion into galactic society, with economic assistance to address the resource scarcities that drove their aggression in the first place. The chamber erupted. The crystalline sovereignty's new representative, one of the few survivors of her species, rose from her seat with fury blazing in her gemstone eyes. You would show them mercy, she demanded. After everything they have done, after the worlds they have burned and the peoples they have slaughtered, you would welcome them back as if nothing happened. Vasquez turned to face the crystal being with an expression of genuine sympathy. I understand your anger, she said. Your people suffered terribly, and nothing can undo that suffering or bring back those who were lost. Then why? Because mercy is not the goal. Vasquez replied, wisdom is the goal, and mercy is simply what wisdom sometimes looks like. She turned to address the full assembly. 3,000 years ago, you ended a war that nearly destroyed civilization, she said. You chose peace not because you were weak, but because you understood that endless conflict serves no one. And yet the Vethkai broke that peace. Yes, Vasquez agreed. They did, and they broke it because the peace was incomplete. She activated a display that showed the economic data from the pre-war period, the resource flows and trade imbalances and territorial boundaries that had slowly strangled the Vethkai Dominion over centuries. The Pax Galactica maintained order, Vasquez explained, but it did not address injustice, and it kept the peace but did not ask why some species prospered while others starved. You blame us for their aggression. No, Vasquez said firmly. I blame them for their choices, and they chose violence when they could have chosen diplomacy, and they chose conquest when they could have chosen cooperation. She paused and let her gaze sweep across the assembled representatives. But I also recognize that desperation leads to desperate actions. And if we want to prevent future wars, we must address the desperation as well as punish the aggression. The young Vethkai queen, Thelrix, sat in the same seat where her predecessor had declared war 14 months ago. She had not spoken since entering the chamber, and she had barely looked at the other representatives who watched her with mixtures of hatred and fear and something that might have been curiosity. Now she rose on unsteady legs and faced the assembly that would decide her people's fate. I have a question for the human ambassador, she said. Vasquez nodded for her to continue. Your people could have destroyed us, Thelrix said. You could have burned our worlds and enslaved our populations and taken everything we have, and no one would have stopped you. That is correct. Instead, you fed us and healed us and rebuilt what we had broken. And now you ask the galaxy to welcome us back. Also correct. Why, it was the same question that High Commander Velthrix had asked Lieutenant Commander Chun on the bridge of her captured flagship. And it seemed to be the only question that truly mattered. Vasquez smiled. And this time, the smile reached her eyes. Because we have been where you are now, she said. Humanity spent thousands of years at war with itself. And we invented new ways to kill each other with a creativity that still horrifies us when we look back at our history. She stepped forward, away from her alcove, and stood in the center of the great chamber where everyone could see her. We learned things during those years, she continued. We learned what hatred costs and what revenge demands, and what happens when you choose to see your enemies as less than people. And what did you learn? We learned that the only wars worth fighting are the ones that make future wars unnecessary. Vasquez said, we learned that enemies can become allies if you give them a reason to change. And we learned that the hardest thing in the universe is not winning a war, but ending one. She looked directly at Thelrix. We choose to help you because your children deserve better than their parents' fears, she said. We choose to help you because holding grudges is exhausting and ultimately pointless. And we choose to help you because it is the right thing to do. The chamber was silent. That is our answer, Vasquez concluded. It is the only answer we have, and if you find it unsatisfying, then perhaps you should consider why you expected something else. She returned to her seat and folded her hands in her lap. And her calm expression gave no indication that she had just reshaped the future of galactic civilization. The vote was not unanimous. Old hatreds do not die easily. And there were species who could not forgive and could not forget, and could not accept that their enemies deserved anything but destruction. But the vote passed and New Pax Galactica began that day. And though some called it the human peace, the Commonwealth formally rejected that title. We did not create this peace, Ambassador Vasquez said when asked about the name. We simply reminded everyone why peace is worth creating. Years later, historians and philosophers would debate what made humanity different from the other species of the galaxy. Some pointed to their unusual evolutionary history and the way they had been forced to cooperate to survive on their hostile homeworld. Others cited their cultural diversity and the thousands of competing philosophies that had somehow combined into a coherent ethical framework. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin, long retired from active service, offered a simpler explanation in her memoirs. We were not special, she wrote. We just remembered what everyone else had forgotten. The point of strength is to make strength unnecessary. The purpose of war is to create peace. And the calmest voice in the room is often the most dangerous, because it belongs to someone who has already decided what they are willing to do and has made peace with the consequences. The galaxy read her words and slowly began to understand. And in the rebuilt halls of the Galactic Concord, where 17 species had once gathered to end a terrible war, new representatives gathered under a new peace. They came from different worlds and different cultures and different evolutionary paths. And they had different memories and different hopes and different fears, but they shared one thing in common. They had all learned what happened when someone broke a 3,000-year peace, and they had all learned what it looked like when humanity answered with calm. It was a lesson none of them would ever forget. The end.